So I'll just give you a very brief snapshot of the Democracy Frontlines Fund. First, let me start by saying that the Libra Foundation is a family foundation based here in San Francisco, and an incredible family that I get an opportunity to work with that has really given the staff of the foundation the bandwidth to expand and try new things. And so, they announced, as Vince said, we doubled our grant making in January of this year, partly because we were listening to our grantees, and they said to us 2020 is going to be the most important year for all of us in our lives. And they didn't even know how prescient that was. But because the family was willing to listen to the grantees who said, you really need to show up for us because we're going to have to really show up in a different way in 2020, we were able to do that. Then fast forward to COVID, then fast forward to George Floyd's murder. And what happened after that was a number of things. I've worked in philanthropy for over 30 years, and I started getting phone calls from colleagues in philanthropy saying, I can't believe this has happened. We're completely devastated. What we were experiencing is a national trauma altogether at the same time, brought on by the media coverage of a murder. And that murder is not unique. Many murders like that have been happening, but we all saw it at the same time in a way in a moment in which our hearts, I think, were actually already broken open given the COVID pandemic. And so what a lot of foundations were saying is we don't really know what to do now. And the Libra team sprung into action with a lot of our colleagues and grantees, and we said, well, maybe we can create an opportunity for people to do something differently. And that's what the Democracy Frontlines Fund is an invitation to funders to join us in doing something really important, funding Black-led organizing at the front lines of democracy. Because one of the things that I think people often don't realize is the movement for civil rights that has been led by Black people in this country has always been at the forefront of defining what it means to have a true, free democracy in which there's full participation. Without that, we would not see all the gains that we've had in this country, like the Voting Rights Act and other things that actually are the ways in which we express what it means to be a democracy in this country. So we wanted to make sure that foundations understood that democracy is not just defined narrowly. Because one of the things I also really realized is for many funders, and frankly, for many folks who are white in this society, and many people in philanthropy are, they were surprised by George Floyd's murder. They were surprised. And what that means to me and what that shows us is privilege narrows our field of vision, doesn't increase it. And so how do we in philanthropy, given that narrowed vision, open it up? How do we actually do that? Well, one of the ways we do that is that we recognize that because our vision is narrow, we are not the best people to be making the decisions about grants in this area. So we created a brain trust of people with decades of experience funding movement, and they made the decisions about that slate of grantees. We're funding general operating support. We're funding multi-year support. We're funding right away. So those grants are going out right now. We launched this initiative in June, or started thinking about it in June. We just recently announced it's $36 million over 3 years to a slate of 10 Black-led organizing groups. And let me talk for a second about what those groups are and who they are and why it's important. Again, expanding our vision about what democracy work is in this country. For many people, they think about the idea that democracy work is really just about registering to vote, the mechanisms of the transaction of being able to do the thing, to do the voting. It's incredibly important, but it's not the only thing. So for example, groups like Black Futures Lab, which is part of the 10 groups that are funded under the Democracy Frontlines Fund, which is really an organization that is deeply embedded in not only the fight for Black liberation, but also understanding more about how the Black community feels, because it's not a monolith, and understanding how to communicate about Black communities. So it's also kind of a media organization. Blackbird, which is the organization that was really responsible for coordinating hundreds of Black-led organizers to work on the Juneteenth this year, when so many people had never heard of Juneteenth before. But it actually became a national conversation with corporations being involved. Again, a communication strategy embedded in an organizing strategy, a really, really important piece. Right after the Democratic and Republican conventions, the Movement for Black Lives, which is also a grantee, hosted the Black National Convention. It was a YouTube-only event, so it was something that they put on. It was not on any of the other channels and networks. Had 250,000 people watch it the first weekend that it happened, and have since had over 1 million people view it. And this is content that is coming out of the community, reaching back into the community, where people are really beginning to understand, what does a movement do? Finally, I just want to say a few things about the importance for us as funders funding differently, particularly when we want to capture what is happening now. Let me just say that for many people, they don't realize that the protests that came about after George Floyd was murdered have been the longest running protest movement in this country, the largest and longest running in the history of this country. It's not totally clear why it is that that's not being covered that way in mainstream media, why the stories have sort of fallen away, but they're still happening. The story is still there. We actually need local journalists who understand how to cover movement. It's almost as if there's so much that people just don't even want to talk about. Why isn't there better science around capturing how many people show up at demonstrations and protests? Why isn't there better understanding amongst the journalists about who do you go and talk to understand which community-based organizations might have been at the beginnings of and help to coordinate many of those protests? They're not just spontaneous, they're actually part of funding that foundations have done and other people have also put forward. And we need journalism that is as smart as the movement is in terms of how it's captured. So I just want to say that I think those kind of key points that we think are really important, funding those people who are closest to the issues, funding Black-led organizing and Latinx organizing, funding Asian American organizing, Native American organizing, incredibly important. The same is true for the journalism that is covering those movements. And also really funding over the long term, because these are the groups that will be foundational. And I'll just end with one quick example. Many people, we remember the 1960s civil rights movement, and we think about someone like Rosa Parks. And oftentimes people think that Rosa Parks was just this kind of singularly brave woman. Rosa Parks was at the Highlander Center weeks before she decided to not give up her seat on the Montgomery bus. The Highlander Center is one of the organizations that is part of the Southern Power Fund, again, a grantee of the Democracy Frontlines Fund. It's an institution in the South in training in nonviolent protest. It's an institution in training and political education around Black liberation. And that organization needs to continue to receive funding into the long term. We need to invest in the organizations that are the groups that will be the foundational groups in the future, the NAACP legal defense funds of 10 to 20 years from now. Rosa Parks was also on staff at the NAACP. It's really important to provide general operating support to organizations because they need to be able to pivot in the times that are happening and be able to shift what they're doing. So you understand that those foundational organizations needed that money, but they also needed the freedom to be able to shift, take advantage, and then launch the Montgomery bus boycott. So all of those are examples of the ways in which, if we actually double down on some of these practices, we can create the transformative press, journalism, media that we're going to need in the future that actually responds to and reflects the future that we all want to live in.